Namaste. We continue now with our study of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, explained by Paramhansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple, Swami Kriyananda. As you can see, we're very much at the beginning, and so we have a long and extremely interesting cycle that we're going to go here. We are in chapter 8 of the book of commentary, which actually is called The Scripture Begins, and today finally we get to stanza 1, chapter 1 of the Gita itself. And that stanza, as Yogananda explains it, sets the stage for the entire meaning of what the Gita is about. And it's so fascinating because in and of itself it seems so simple, but as I'll explain on behalf of Swamiji and Master, there's a lot implied here. So the stanza reads, Dhritarashtra posed this question to Sanjaya. On the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where my sons and those of Pandu were ranged against one another, eager for battle, what was the outcome? Now, to set the stage a little bit, we've talked about this. Dhritarashtra is the king, and his sons are the Kauravas, and the Kauravas represent the ways of non-virtue, of adharma. Sanjaya is his attendant, and Dhritarashtra represents the blind mind. He's actually physically blind in the story, but what he's representing is the mind that is blinded to anything that is not immediately perceivable by the senses. You know, I'm sure many of you know people like this, who, if they can't touch it and feel it and see it and weigh it and measure it, for them it doesn't exist. Whereas others who have more of an intuitive feeling about life are more, who may have meditated or in some other way discovered a reality that transcends the senses, feel that such a person is literally blind. And that is the contrast between those who become spiritually awake and those who cling to materialism as the greatest reality, the only reality. So Dhritarashtra as the father, as the sire of all of these forces of materialism, is himself physically blind to make the intention of it quite clear. And Sanjaya, his attendant, has the ability to see at a distance. So the way this story takes place, Dhritarashtra is not on the battlefield, but his attendant has been given this grace by Krishna, I believe, to be able to see what's going on. Now, you would assume, and what Sanjaya represents, his symbolic quality, is the quality of introspection, that he can review and reflect on what has taken place. Now, you would think if this was really a physical battle, and this is where the key reality of this chapter becomes so relevant. If this were a physical battle, it would be obvious that Dhritarashtra, the king, would say, what is going on? Who is winning? But the question is phrased in the past tense. It's phrased, what was the outcome? And since Sanjaya is able to see at a distance, there's no reason for the king to ask that, except that the true meaning of Kurukshetra and the true meaning of this battle is revealed right here at the beginning. Because the battle is the inner struggle, the field of Kurukshetra, and we've talked about this in previous classes. The field of Kurukshetra is the field of inner consciousness. And Sanjaya, representing the power of introspection, is explaining to us that in the midst of the psychological struggle, it's impossible for us to know who's winning, or even where this is going to go. By the very nature of it, if we were able to stand back with enough detachment to evaluate it, it wouldn't be happening. It would already be over. Because when you're in the midst of it, you're caught up in the midst of it, and you're just trying to determine what's correct and what's not correct, trying to hold your own against the forces of temptation, the forces of wrong attitude. And only after it's done can we stand back and say, well, what was the outcome of that? Now, the difficulty, now introspection is essential to enlighten the blind mind. We have to reflect on what we're doing. We have to evaluate. We have to stop and see what are the consequences. Again, if you think about people who are serious about their spiritual intention and able to carry out that intention with some energy and some commitment, one of the qualities of that kind of spiritual seriousness is the willingness to review and evaluate. One of the characteristics of people who just aren't interested in spiritual life is you just can't talk to them about it. They don't introspect. They just do what they do, and they never stop and ask, where is this going? What is this going to lead to? Did I live up to my high ideals? Did I give in to a lower aspect of myself that I don't really want to give energy to? I am smiling in this context because there were two girls who in our community who were among the earliest residents of our community some 45 years ago. And neither of them chose to follow an explicitly spiritual path. But nonetheless, many of the values of Ananda and values of the spiritual life were taken in through the air they breathed during some of their childhood at Ananda village. And one of them, as an adult woman, was heard to remark to the other, all our friends just do whatever they want to do, but you and I always have to think about the deeper meaning of what we do. And in that sense, she was complaining slightly that they're bound by this code that was gifted to them truly in their growing up years. And they observed that many of their colleagues and companions, they just didn't bother. They just did what they wanted to do and enjoyed themselves, and that was that. But once the desire for personal growth, for self-expansion, for higher ideals really begins to grow in us, then Sanjaya comes right with it. He comes right in, and in all circumstances he stops and asks the question, what happened here? And what can we say about what happened here? And how can we tell whether the Kauravas or the Pandavas are winning? Now, part of the difficulty with introspection is complicated, because the ego-motivated self is the Kauravas, is the definition, that part of ourselves which wants to protect our tiny self-interest and doesn't want to transcend that individual desire and allow the consciousness to expand into a greater field of awareness. And of course these points will be elucidated much more as we continue. But the mind itself, the introspective mind itself, is often very strongly influenced by the very delusions that we're setting out to overcome. I mean, a way of thinking about this is we have many inner voices. We have the voice of subconscious habit, we have the voices of fear, we have the voices of desire, we have the voices of social conditioning, we have the voice of laziness, and then we also have the voice of intuition and of God whispering to us and of our higher aspirations trying to fulfill themselves. And it's not always easy to tell who's speaking, because often the voice of subconscious habit, for example, will feel very right because it's so comfortable. It's so known to us. It's where all of our energy wants to flow. So we'll say, this feels right. My inner voice tells me this feels right. But you see, there's many different levels of our own reality. There was a friend once who was determined on a certain course of action, and he was not receptive to input from Swamiji or from anyone else who wanted to give it. And I happened to be present when Swamiji was talking to him and trying to dissuade him from a course of action which he did follow in the end and which did not serve him spiritually. The final result was not what that devotee had hoped for. But he kept arguing, the devotee kept arguing with Swamiji, but it feels so right. And afterwards, because Swamiji allowed me often to ask him questions so that I could understand this more deeply, I said, my perception of this man is he's closed off from all input, so there's no one inside of him but his own egoic preferences. So naturally, it feels very harmonious because there's no interfering force in there. He's no longer at war. He simply allowed the limited self to have full sway. And so he insists that it feels right. Swami said, yes, exactly. And even Swamiji couldn't break through that because a true teacher won't. You have to invite the input of wiser beings than yourself, whether embodied advisors or the subtle force of the Master. Master used to tell a story that is very apt, and it's very important to understand it in this way. There was a Brahmin who was being troubled. His services were being interrupted by the presence of a demon. And so the Brahmin went to another priest and asked him if he could do something about the demon. And so the priest gave him a box of powder, and he said, the next time the demon appears and tries to interrupt your ceremony, shake this powder on him and it'll make him go away. So the demon appeared, as he had been appearing, to pollute the Brahmin's ceremony, and the Brahmin righteously took the powder and shook it on the demon. It had no effect whatsoever on the demon. And the Brahmin was even more disconcerted, and the demon said very simply, before your priest could put his incantations on that powder, I got in there first. Now, what that's about, that's representing that merely because we look inside, the mind is already there. The demon, so to speak, of self-interest is the word I really want to use, of egoic self-interest. Our consciousness is permeated with egoic self-interest. So Master states quite definitely that the only way that in intuition, introspection, sanjaya, can really report accurately, introspection has to be aided by the guidance of a guru, by the openness to be enlightened from a different level of consciousness. This is very tricky, and what this whole chapter is about, this chapter in Swamiji's book, his commentary, is about how very tricky it is to be able to evaluate ourselves without also including in that introspection a prayerful receptivity and a genuine openness, not only to say, well, this is what I feel, but also to hear the advice of others. Often I've been dismayed when people will hear what Swamiji has said or hear good advice from reliable sources, people who really have their best interests at heart and have proven wisdom. Oftentimes when people ask me, how can I be sure? I say to people, you really have to cultivate in your life friendships with people whose impersonal wisdom you can trust. Because you can listen to other people's reactions, and listening to other people's reactions and observing the effect of your actions on others is one way to tell who's winning. The battle of Kurukshetra, the inner battle, whether you are following the Pandavas, the way of righteousness, or the non-virtuous ways of the Kauravas. But people are also guided by self-interest. And too often, those who have a stake or have an attachment to what you do and how you do it are not always your wisest advisors. And so it's sometimes, it's a very good practice, if you possibly can, to cultivate relationships with people whose impersonal wisdom you can trust. You shouldn't follow them mindlessly, but you should be open to hearing what they have to say and hold it up impartially to the light within you. Because so often people will say, well, this is what I was going to say. Merely, if God can speak to you, if you can be guided superconsciously about your own life, it's also true that someone else can be guided superconsciously about your life. If God can speak to you, he can also speak through others. And very often where one's own self is concerned, it's wise to be a little bit careful. Because, as I was saying, things can feel right without actually being right. Right now, I want to use in the right sense. Right in this sense is that it's actually moving you not toward temporary pleasure or even temporary relief of tension, but these are actions that will actually, in the end, guide you to where you really want to be. And when I was speaking of that devotee who was determined on a course of action that did not in the end prove beneficial, part of the problem is that it takes a while. It takes a while for results to show sometimes. And that's why the inspiration and the guidance of a true guru is so essential for success on the spiritual path. And of course, in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is presenting his inner dilemmas, his psychological battles. He's presenting them to Krishna. And he's presenting them with complete humility, with the courage to say what he has to say, but with the complete humility to hear what Krishna has to offer. Now, of course, we would all think if I could be in the chariot with Krishna as my driver, then I would listen. But we're all in a chariot with Krishna as our driver. It's the question of how open we are as devotees to really hear and to respond and to do what's necessary. That is always the key factor here. Now, the power of the guru is, you see, he can see where all roads lead. And when we're just standing behind our own desires, we can't see where that road leads. Literally, those desires blind us, and the guru stands above and can see which is a cul-de-sac and which actually takes us to the top of the mountain. This is skipping ahead a little bit in the Gita, but I'm thinking of it now. This is a story that I included in my book about Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him. It's a story from my own experience. And I was faced with a dilemma, a personal decision that had to be made. And it had to go one way or another. There was no middle ground. Either I had to do this or I had to do that. And it whirled around in my consciousness for many weeks. And I prayed, I thought, in my own way, for an answer. But I simply could not get an answer, and I just couldn't tell what I was supposed to do. And it was a fairly serious conflict, question of Dharma. Finally, I was speaking to Swami Kriyananda, trying to elicit some clarity through my conversation with him, because Swamiji was among a number of people whose impersonal wisdom I trusted. He was, of course, my primary source of inspiration, but I had a number of others, have and had a number of others whose point of view I listen to. I don't always agree with it, but I listen, because I know that they have my best interests at heart and have the capacity to be able to discern often when I can't. Well, I was sitting in front of Swamiji, and I was very dramatic in the moment. And I was weeping, And I was sort of saying through my tears, "Oh, Swamiji, it's so hard to know what God wants." And I put it out with all that anguish that I was capable of in those days. And Swami looked at me very calmly, without at all participating in the drama of what I was doing. And I said, "It's so hard to know what God wants." And Swamiji just said, "No, it isn't." Just like that. And then he didn't really say anything else. It was like, I thought that was the beginning of a conversation, but it wasn't. It was the end of it. And when it was clear to me that our time together was done, I went back to the little trailer where I lived at that time. And I sat to meditate, and my first thought was a little bit on the rebellious side. You know, one has to be very observant of one's own inner nature. And I was rebelling against what Swami was doing because he had been so unwilling to participate in my emotional drama. And I wanted someone to get in there and grovel with me, suffer with me, and he just remained quite outside of it. And then he said, you know, he told me that I said, "This is difficult." He said, "No, it's not." And so I wanted to reject him. I wanted to say, "Well, what does he know?" or something like that. But I was trapped by my own faith. I knew Swamiji. I knew his wisdom. And I knew his goodness. And I knew his track record with me. And even though I wanted to rebel, and all my little Kauravas were telling me to fight against him, and I thought that wasn't wise. And so the first thing I thought was, I realized, well, it's easy for him to know. After all, he was a direct disciple of Master, and I started all these thoughts in my mind. But then I realized I hadn't said it's hard for me to know, and he hadn't answered, well, it's easy for him to know. He just said it's not difficult to know. It was a very different answer. So then I became intrigued. You see, if we listen carefully, I was talking to someone, I'm going to interrupt slightly, I was talking to someone recently, and they had received some advice from Ananda's current spiritual director, Jyotish, the Swamiji's appointed successor. And Jyotish had said something specific to this man, and when he said it to me, I said, "Well, what did he mean by that?" Because it wasn't clear to me. And the man said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, did you ask him?" "No." I said, "Well, you must ask him. You can't just take that home and try to intuit it, because then you're back with your own, you're back in your own reality. When someone like Jyotish speaks to you and you don't understand it, you also have to have the courage and the self-confidence to not, you don't have to pretend that you understand." And the man admitted that's exactly what he was doing. He didn't want to admit that he didn't understand. I said, "How can he help you? How can he help you if you don't have the humility to be yourself in front of him?" So there I was in private now with Swami, because he hadn't given me, I mean, in the privacy of my own consciousness, but I had mastered, at least to some small extent, the humility to have heard him accurately. Because that's another thing that we do, is we just change what we hear. We just change it so it suits us a little better. But I had heard him accurately. So if it isn't hard to know, I then ask the next obvious question: why is it hard for me to know? And I asked that question, essentially I asked that question of Swamiji, even though he wasn't present. I asked it of him in the realm of the dimension where consciousness is united. And the answer I got was just as plain as day: because you don't want to know. And again, ego wanted to say, "Yes, I do, look at me, I've been crying for weeks because I don't know." But instead I didn't, even though the Kaurava got in there and tried to get me to say that. No, I said, then I suddenly realized, no, I don't want to know. I mean, I prefer the drama of uncertainty to actually having to choose between these two options, because both of them seem fraught with difficulty to me. And so I realized I don't want to know. I said, "Why don't I want to know?" The answer again, clear as day: because you're afraid. Yeah, I'm afraid. I'm attached to all options. I don't want to have to choose here. To have to make this choice is going to break my heart. And I'm afraid of that. I wasn't even afraid of doing the wrong thing, because what am I afraid of was my next question. And the answer came, because you're going to lose something you're attached to. You already know what God wants, but that means you're going to lose something you're attached to. Oh, like that. Okay, now you see I'm fighting the right battle. If we're thinking of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the right warriors are going against each other. It's my fear of losing versus understanding that God knows what's best for me. Now you see, that's quite different than what does God want. Now I clearly know what God wants. And what God wants is for me to give up this attachment. And I don't want to give up the attachment. But that's a real battle. When I was fighting the other battle, what does God want? What does God want? There was only one soldier in that battle, and that was just me, my ego, just running itself in circles because it didn't really want to engage with the warrior that it had to engage with, which was attachment and loss. And so we go through the whole, as we will, with the 18 days of the war that's fought and all the different soldiers that fight each other. This is all in the Mahabharata, and only doesn't really come up so much in the Gita, just a little bit. But we need to be guided. We need to have Krishna drive the chariot, and the chariot is really our body. We're in our body, but we're guided by God. We have to have him take us place by place to the right battles, so that we'll actually be progressing toward that which we really need to progress toward. You can see how subtle this is. And we should never, ever be overconfident, arrogant. In other words, humility is always required when we talk about classes and teaching about how to understand your inner guidance. One of the greatest obstacles to inner guidance, oddly, is overconfidence in your guidance. Because as soon as we become overconfident, often you see the ego gets engaged again. This is my guidance. And then we don't have the humility to follow the progression of that guidance. As we often use as the example, your guidance may be to go north, and you decide north is the way that we go. But it may be, in fact, that you're only supposed to go a short distance north before you turn east or turn west. But if you have dogmatized the instruction to go north and have allowed the ego to be so proud because God has told me to go north, when he says then to make a turn off of that path, you won't know it. I remember in one particular circumstance I was in, there was a big group of people who were having to make a decision about how to progress with a certain project. And somewhere very early on, I had an intuition, and I just knew what we ought to do. But I didn't handle the intuition well. And I tried to impose that intuition as my intuition on others who did not see it that way. And eventually I created so much disharmony that I finally had to withdraw from the discussion, and I wrote a note to everyone involved, and I said, you know, I did feel that I received a true intuition on this, but true or not, that intuition has now been so corrupted by my attachment to it that I feel the only thing for me to do right now is withdraw from the discussion. And I did, and the disharmony settled down, and in the end they made exactly the decision that I thought should have been made. But it was still a very important lesson for me, far from making me feel, you see, I was right. It was how subtle the battle actually is. And this is why both honest introspection and humility and deep receptivity to the guidance of the Guru, whether he speaks to you directly in your own meditation or in the voice of others he can also inspire, the humility to hear that will be what keeps us safe from delusion, which will allow us to fight and win with the Pandavas instead of getting lost in the army of the Kauravas. Now, Swamiji offers us here also some of the guidelines for how you can tell whether certain decisions are actually taking you in the right direction or not. Now, as I was saying earlier and have pointed out, this does not always happen immediately because wrong results can also masquerade as right results. But Swami gives us 4 essential points that show us that we are on the right course. And the first is an expansion and increase of joy and freedom. And the second is an overall expansion of consciousness. The third is an expansion of our heart's sympathy for the reality and the needs of others. And the fourth is a state of calmness. Now, let's talk about all of these because these are, in a sense, the infallible signs of spiritual progress. Now, joy and freedom, I remember Swamiji was asked once by someone how much tapasya is enough, how much discipline is enough, and he said that which you can do with joy. As long as there's an increasing sense of joy, then your self-discipline is appropriate. Now, all of these are a little bit tricky because we're talking about spiritual qualities. You can feel a great deal of pleasure. You can feel a release of tension. You can feel a kind of wild letting go. Swamiji commented there was a billboard that we used to drive by on the way up to Ananda village because there's a certain point where the highway divides and you can go toward Reno, Nevada or Las Vegas, Nevada, where you can gamble and drink and do many of the other things that Nevada allows to happen and is well known for. And the billboard has several people enjoying themselves in a casino somewhere. And it says, "Let yourself go in Las Vegas." And Swami commented, they don't look so much like they're letting themselves go, it's like they're falling to pieces. And that is really what they look like. I mean, the artist, in trying to depict this kind of a sensual pleasure, these are disintegrating right in front of us, these artistic renditions of people supposedly being happy. But joy is a very different quality. Joy is a quality of the soul. Really, Ananda is what we're talking about. We have to use the Sanskrit word to say it accurately. Ananda means joy, but it means a joy of the soul. So often, you may actually not be having any fun at all. You may feel very constricted and deprived on a certain level, but there'll be a deep level of joy underneath it. I think of the champion athletes and how intensely they train, and certainly not every hour of their training is pleasurable for them. But the determination and the capacity to set themselves such a high goal and to carry it out without flinching gives them a deep sense of joy, because they're doing something that's worth doing. And when Swami was talking about how much discipline is enough, you have to do the discipline that you understand why you're doing it. That it's not just imposed upon you by an unfeeling God who wants to take away from you all your fun in life. And so there's a certain dogmatic discipline that's imposed that we don't really understand why we're doing it. If we don't understand why we're doing it, the joy is not there. So that kind of joy which underlies all the ups and downs of life and the ins and outs of pleasure is quite different than that kind of joy. And when you're living in the right way, you have this satisfaction in your heart. And Swami couples that with a kind of freedom, because being able to be aware of that inward joy gives you a freedom in this world that you don't have without it. Because that freedom is to be able to resist, to stand up against the temptation to be dishonorable, to seek short-term satisfaction instead of long-term goals. There's been a lot of studies about education for children and what really makes success in life, and they started doing this cookie experiment with children, where they would put a child in a room with a cookie, a young child, with a cookie, and they would tell that child, if you can refrain from eating this cookie for the next 3 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever was an appropriate time span, then you can not only have this cookie, you can have 2 others. And then they would leave the child alone with this cookie and the camera on him or her. And the films would come out of the children, all the different ways they would deal with the cookie. Some of them just would eat the cookie. The impulse restraint was 0. 1 cookie now was much better than the promise of 3 cookies in the future. Others would stare at the cookie, smell the cookie, hold the cookie up, wave the cookie around, cover their eyes so they didn't have to look at the cookie, all kinds of different things, but would not eat it. Now, interestingly, in the studies, whatever they were, those who could discipline themselves in the moment for the benefit that they knew was coming were the ones who proved to be the most successful in life. It wasn't intelligence or talent or test scores, it was what they ended up calling delayed gratification. Now, that's freedom. That's freedom because you can say, I'm really going over there, and I don't have to worry about what's happening now because I have my eye on the goal. And even if these circumstances are not exactly what I want, I have the freedom to choose. I'm not compelled by my overwhelming desire to eat this 1 cookie that I cannot even think of my own best welfare. This is the Kauravas, just trying to tell us that the only reality is the reality we see right now, and to disconnect us from the higher dimension of where we're really going. So right action brings an increase of joy and freedom. When I met Swami Kriyananda for the first time in November of 1969, that's what I saw in him. I saw in him joy, and I saw in him freedom, of the kind that I so deeply wanted. I could barely intuit even what it was I was seeking, and I don't think I could have articulated it when I saw it, but I knew it was what I wanted. I articulated it as, he has what I want. I could feel the joy, and I could feel that, I could feel the expansiveness, that there was no limit to his consciousness. And I, by contrast, felt so confined. I had no freedom at all. I was confined by my ego identity. I didn't know what to call it at that point. But I knew that I did not have freedom. I wasn't making free choices. I was compelled in all directions. And to give in to those compulsions is the first sort of immature concept of freedom. True freedom is to be able to choose the path that you will follow, and that's what I felt in Swami. Freedom and joy. That is the criteria by which you can measure whether or not you're on the right path. Now, the second one he describes is an overall expansion of consciousness. Now, an overall expansion of consciousness is that you begin to be aware of yourself as more than just identified with this physical body. You can, how do I say this? I mean, your relationship even to life and death becomes different. You're living in a greater reality than just the physical moment. I mean, again, you contrast this to people who are very unconscious. They don't think, if I'm smoking, they don't think about the consequences of smoking. If they're eating terrible foods, they don't think about the consequences of eating terrible foods. If they're mean to the people around them, they're not aware that there's anybody else out there. I had a friend who was just, she was an amazing person. She was an acquaintance, I would say, not a friend. she just talked all the time about what was ever in her head. And I laughingly realized that she didn't really know there was anyone else out there. She was so caught in her own flow of energy and her perceptions that she was just always giving those to the world. And the rest of us were just her audience, I guess. She just didn't know we were there. That's the only way I can say it. Her consciousness was so defined by whatever she was perceiving that she just didn't know that there was a greater reality. And so there's a general expansion of consciousness. I was talking to Swamiji about this at different points, and just saying to him, in my own life, like nothing of very dramatic. I don't have any kind of dramatic experiences at all. Nothing happens. No bells, no whistles, no flashing lights, just nothing. But there is this ever-expanding sense of reality. I don't know how else to put it. That even though the world looks exactly the same to me, there's this awareness of past lives and future lives and this drama that we're all living together, and how this little life that we're living is just one small part of this much more expanded potential. And right action increases our sense of reality instead of binding us more and more to, what about me? What's going to happen to me? What do I want? What am I going to get? How does this affect me? How are, all of that. How are you all going to relate to me? Consciousness just expands, and we see the whole thing as an interwoven tapestry. Now, Swamiji points out that just as joy and freedom can be misunderstood, I have the freedom to do whatever I want and that makes me happy, is quite different than I have the freedom to choose that which is best for me, and that gives me a deep sense of inner joy. So in expansion of consciousness, people can mistake the fact that if they have an increase of power, and I don't mean power in the power to do good, but just power over others, dominion over others, influence over others, the feeling that I have the money, or I have the position, or I have the physical brute strength, I can do whatever I want. A person may mistake that for an expanded sense of consciousness, expanded consciousness, but egoic power is not really an awareness that we are part of a greater reality. In our Festival of Light, the ritual that we do every Sunday, that phrase is repeated: you are part of all that is. You are part of a greater reality. Let us celebrate our greater reality. All of these phrases are continually offered, and because it's a ritual and we hear it every week, it goes deeper and deeper into our consciousness. Oh, I am part of a greater reality. And we may feel that with other people, or we may feel that with the sunrise or the forest. We just know that I am a bubble in the vast ocean, and I am part of the ocean, but the ocean is, it's more, the ocean includes me rather than I include the ocean. You see, there's a great deal of difference. And there's a great deal of freedom in that also, you see. And also joy, because so much of what people suffer from is loneliness and a sense of powerlessness. That's why they try to make the ego more powerful, like Duryodhana in the Mahabharata leading to the Bhagavad Gita. But real power is to be part of this greater reality, because then you surrender to that greater flow, and you find that your own best interests are also taken care of. Now, the third point that Swamiji describes to tell you that you are on the right course is an expansion of sympathy for others. And I find this so touching, this particular point, and reassuring in a very deep way, because, and also it's a very clear, it's a very bright line and an easy one to see, because when the ego is growing, one is indifferent to the welfare of others, and that's how you see people doing just horrible things. I mean, start with murder or thievery or but also much of the legal thievery that is become so much a part of our culture these days, of public officials embezzling or directing money for their self-interest, and financiers and banks just taking more and more for themselves because they can, and salaries and bonuses, and just certain people just grabbing more and more and taking it away from others without concern. They're developing their power, but the results of that are not pretty. But when we're truly following the right course, this very deep sense of compassion for others comes with it. But we have to understand that joy also comes with that expansion of sympathy. Because if it's an expansion of sympathy that just makes us afraid and miserable and everybody's unhappy and what are we going to do? It's an expansion of sympathy that comes when we realize that we're all on the same path to freedom and bliss. And we're all here to help each other, because an expansion of consciousness helps us to realize that this is an interrelated universe. A friend of mine had this very sweet dream. And the dream was that a great group of Ananda devotees were all standing in a very large circle together. And every so often, one or another would ascend, and they would turn into shimmering light, and they would just rise up into the infinite, and their physical form would no longer be visible because they had transcended and gone into the light. And my friend described that it was beautiful to see people transforming into light, but the part of the dream that was the most meaningful to her was she realized that there was no sense of jealousy or envy among any of the people in the circle, because if one ascended to the light, then all of them were able to rejoice in that freedom. And they knew their own turn would come. But it was even more than that. It was that we are a part of all that is. And if there is light anywhere, there is light everywhere. And this is what makes spiritual people so spontaneously kind, spontaneously generous. It's not a matter of disciplining yourself to do so. It's just the natural awakened sympathy of the heart. There's a sweet story told about Master. Master's father was very successful in what he did, and he indulged his sons to a certain extent. And Master, as a young man, bought a motorcycle, and the motorcycle had a sidecar, and sometime his guru, Sri Yukteswar, would sit in the sidecar and he would drive the motorcycle around, and he really enjoyed that motorcycle. And he was sitting in front of his house, and an acquaintance was there, not a man who was particularly close to him, and the man was admiring the motorcycle. "Wow," he said, "I'd love to have a motorcycle like that." And Master said, "Would you? I'll give you this one." And the man said, "Well, I could never accept something so expensive." And Master said, "But I could never enjoy it knowing that you want it." And he went into the house and he got the pink slip. I guess it's called pink slip in India also, which had the ownership on it. And he transferred ownership and just gave it to him, just like that. And Master was telling the truth. I could never enjoy it now knowing that you wanted it. And in Whispers from Eternity, Master has some beautiful poems in there about, teach me to spend as freely for others as I spend for myself. And it's a very good way to think about it. Oh, I love that new jacket. Oh, I like this, new bicycle. I think I'll get it for myself. Can we spend as freely for others as we spend for ourselves? Now, just to put a condition here, it's very important to do that which you understand. How much discipline is enough discipline? That discipline which is really an honest expression of your consciousness. If you do it just because you ought to, you can't buy your way into heaven, because this is not about dogma. This is about the actual spontaneous expression of what my consciousness really is. That's why Master says, teach me to be able to do this, not make me do this. I will do this. Teach me to do this. so that my sympathy really has expanded to the point where this is a natural expression of who I am. You practice when it's easier. You start smaller. And when you get talented, it's smaller, and your joy and your freedom expands. Then you can fight. Now, putting all this, fight that battle. I was thinking of the Battle of Kurukshetra. There's a rule, and in the Mahabharata they explain it. The rules of war is that combatants have to be equal. That you can't, someone who's much stronger, or they have to be equal in their weapons, and they have to be equal in their prowess. And all through the 18 days of the Mahabharata battle, the battles have to be between equals. That's the only honorable way. Now, considering this to be a psychological battle and not just a physical battle, you see, the battle has to be between equals. And you can't give away your motorcycle if to give away the motorcycle is a soldier much bigger than your capacity to fight it. You can give away a favorite book. Perhaps you can pay for someone's dinner. It just depends on what is the real battle for you to fight and where you really find joy and not a deep sense of suppression and inner resistance. But that is a sign. Look how my sympathy is expanding. Joy and freedom, a sense of a greater reality, expanded consciousness, and an increasing sympathy for others. And you see, this is also part of the path of self-realization, as Krishna and now as Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda are teaching it to us. This is not a path in which we turn our back on the welfare of others. This is not a path in which we just say, if I am progressing, that's all that matters. Part of the way I progress is an expansion of sympathy. Now, one can be a hermit and still have a deeply expanded sense of sympathy, and even dedicate one's own meditation for the welfare of others. Swamiji wrote a prayer that is the prayer for Ananda. May the divine light awaken, just think how to say it. Awaken my heart and bring enlightenment to all beings. I may not be saying that exactly right, but I think that's right. May the divine light awaken my heart and bring enlightenment to all beings. I think Swamiji said that a little better, and for the moment, suddenly it's out of my mind. But I'll get it exactly right for next week. But you see how important that is. It's, I want enlightenment. Master said the highest prayer is, God, give me thyself that I may give thee to all. Because that's fundamental to the teachings of Krishna. And when Jesus said the same thing, love one another, and by your love for one another, they will know that you are my disciples. Master brought the unity of those two teachings. Now the last sign of introspection's evaluation of who has won the battle is increasing calmness. And calmness is a very important part of this, because one of the ways that you can tell that your inspiration, for example, is divinely inspired and not egoically inspired is how calmly you feel about it. In that example that I gave, where I myself had an intuition that eventually proved to be the decision everyone else made, what I lost was calmness. I became very intent that everybody had to listen to me. I didn't have the calm understanding that truth will win out in the end, that I can present my point of view, but if people are not accepting it, I don't have to become agitated about making them accept it. True intuition is very calm. My intuition had been calm when I received it, but I agitated it with ego attachment. And once I lost that calmness, I knew eventually I was no longer fighting on the side of the Pandavas. I was suddenly fighting on the side of the Kauravas. I'd lost the sense of it. And in terms of joy, one of the differences between egoic or sensual happiness and spiritual happiness is calmness. Just as simple as that. People go, well, to Las Vegas, and the music is loud, and the slot machines are going, and everything is so crazy, and the last thing you have in that is calmness. Calmness and joy, that's what we're looking for. Calmness also is a confidence. You're calm because you're confident. You know that you're where you're meant to be and God is in charge. And so where is the reason? Where is the anxiety? Where is the tension? And we can tell a certain action is the right action if it makes us calm. We can be afraid, even sad, and still be calm. When I was in that cycle that I had to go through of trying to understand God's will, and I realized that I was going to have to face a very difficult test of detaching myself from something I was deeply attached to. Even though I wasn't happy about it, there was a certain calmness to it. And my upset prior to that, what does God want? What does God want? It had no calmness to it. But once I realized, oh, I know what God wants, it makes me very sad, and it's going to be very challenging for me to carry out. But I was very calm about it. And every time we're on the side of the Pandavas, what comes with it is a certain calmness that is underneath it. It's the calmness also that comes with freedom, because we know we have the freedom to choose, and therefore we can just accept what comes without agitation. All of those working together are really essential points. Now, there's one more point that I want to talk about. Well, actually, there seems to be quite a few more, but one more that I really wanted to point out because it's directly from the Gita, and I want to just bring it up before we end this chapter. One of the lines in the Gita, it actually comes from stanza number 10 in the first chapter. In the middle of the second chapter, Swamiji starts going verse by verse, just so you'll know. But the first chapter he does in a more general way, without hitting every stanza. But it also talks about the fact that the Kaurava forces, as the way he puts it, are innumerable, whereas the forces of righteousness are few in number. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover this as completely as I want to, so I may bring it up again in our next session. But Swamiji has a very interesting way of describing it. He talks about when you're on the circumference of the circle. And if we think of divine enlightenment being in the center of the circle, and our distance to it being measured how far we go out from the center to the edge of the circle, you can see from the edge of the circle there's a great distance, and there's many different ways that you can come into the center. And what Swamiji is describing, the Kauravas are this great circle around the center. And you can see how large the circle can be, but it can emanate all from this one point. This is the eternal now. This is divine enlightenment. This is divine understanding. And so there's innumerable ways for you to be drawn out into delusion. As Swami puts it in another place, Master puts it in another place. If you hate things, if you decide you want to hate, you can hate everything. But when you move more toward the center of our own nature, and the circumference becomes smaller and smaller as we move to the center until we enter into that single dot around which the whole center, the whole circle is built, you can see that the options are many fewer, because once we attune ourselves to that divine reality, then the qualities are self-evident and they're simple. The complexity declines and the simplicity reigns. I'm not really going to have time to explain it more clearly than that, so I'm going to just leave that point and come to it later. But I want to just mention this one thing that Swamiji said once so beautifully. I mean, he was quoting what is well known. You know, delusion is complex, but God is simple. We imagine because delusion is so complex that the creator of that delusion must be even more complex. But the beauty of the spiritual life is it's just the opposite. The closer we come to the center of our own nature, the more like childlike in our simplicity we become. So I'm going to leave that point now, but we're not quite finished. So I'll start there the next time we meet. God bless you.